I titled today's Neville Goddard conversation, Transformation of Others via Self. The premise of our conversation is this quote here, in which he states, "The world is a magic circle of infinite possible mental transformations, for there are an infinite number of possible mental conversations. When man discovers the creative power of inner talking, he will realize his function and his mission in life. Then he can act to a purpose. Without such knowledge, he acts unconsciously. Everything is a manifestation of the mental conversations which go on in us without our being aware of them. But as civilized beings, we must become aware of them and act with a purpose." So he says, without such knowledge, he acts unconsciously. Now, in the last few videos, we talked about encouraging the reality of our imagination. And one of the important aspects of recognizing or encouraging the reality of our imagination is essentially the conversations that we have within ourselves, inside of ourselves, and the relationship of those conversations in how it plays out with vivid detail as far as our relationship goes with others, how we relate to them, and how they relate to us. And so he also says everything is a manifestation of the mental conversations which go on in us without our being aware of them. Without our being aware of them. So how do we become aware of them? Well, we simply look around at our world, at our relationships, how we communicate in relation to others, how we communicate in relation to ourselves, the theater that plays out, which we call life. And this reveals our internal dialogue, our inner conversations. And if we change these inner conversations, we will see the changes. Now, some of us know of the story of Dr. Hugh Len, who happened to have cured every patient in the criminal ward of Hawaii State Hospital without ever seeing a single patient. I'm going to put a link in the description to a video series in which he discusses it. And so he actually did this without ever seeing a single patient. What he did was he set up an office within the hospital to review his patient files. And while he looked at those files, he would go to work on himself. He was changing his internal dialogue in relation to the five sensory experience. And over the course of around 4 years, it said that the patients were all healed. And even the staff who had been calling in sick or quitting eventually loved coming to work. And so he called this the internal cleaning or the cleaning. Or more specifically put, falling in love with the data, making peace with the data. Now, let's talk about inner conversations. All of us would love the ability to be able to speak ourselves into a state of mind. What I recognize on my journey is that the programming, or as he refers to, the data within myself, would argue with the conscious choice of the words in relation to others. Oh, the person cannot become like that, or this is how they were in the past. And I would essentially self-persuade myself outside of the state of mind that's one with that vision realized, which is how they actually are, as we have discussed many times. What he was really doing, and what Neville suggests, is to imagine people lovingly. And so, here to articulate this, he said, "How would I send my word to help a friend? I would imagine that I am hearing his voice, that he is physically present, that my hand is on him. I would then congratulate him on his good fortune, tell him that I have never seen him look better. I would listen as though I heard him. I would imagine that he is telling me he has never felt better. He has never been happier. And I would know that in this loving, knowing communion with another, a communion populous with loving thoughts and feelings, that my word was sent, and it shall not return unto me void, but it shall prosper whereto I send it. So the inner conversation, and feeling the reality of the inner conversation, from the premise of how they truly are, which is a representation of love, transforms the individual. Transformation is happening within ourselves. And it externalizes as the appearance of others being transformed. Now, I remember learning this from one of my earlier mentors back in 2000. He actually rose up from entry-level position to chief executive officer in a company that he worked for in Trinidad and Tobago. Now, he taught me a lot of things, but one time he said to me, he said, "What do you believe is the most important thing we could do in life?" So I gave him my responses of what I thought it was, based on where I was at that stage of the journey. And then he gave me his opinion. He said, "Well, I believe that the most important thing we could do in this life is to turn an enemy into a friend." Now, when he said this to me, it had an impression on me, because he said it with such conviction. And then he shared with me many stories of how he did the exact same thing that we were talking about. He realized that he was the cause of the outer effects in his life. And these stories had an impression on me. And upon deep realization, it was really his inner conversations that he was changing, which brought him into different states of mind, which from those states of mind he experienced the visions as a result of what he saw in his imagination, which was imagining lovingly. So Neville states, "Our inner conversations represent in various ways the world we live in. Our individual worlds are self-revelations of our own inner speech. We are told that every idle word that men shall speak, they shall give account thereof, for by their words they shall be justified, and by their words they shall be condemned." So why is it that, and I'll reflect back on my journey, and I feel like I am understanding what he has shared with me more so every day. Seems like it continues to bring forth higher degrees of realization. And I've realized this through my own experience in relationships, friendships, business partners. When I saw certain interactions in which a part of me was seeing them from a conflicting perspective, I then realized it was the data, as Dr. Uland refers to. I'm going to put a link in the description to a video series in which he talks about it in detail. I recommend watching it. But it was me identifying with certain thinking patterns. So by making peace with these thinking patterns, I was able to allow myself to believe the suggestions from my inner conversations as the reality, as we discussed in the last few videos. The imaginal activity as truth, realizing that the internal world, that which we see in our imagination, is the source. And although we might be imagining unconsciously, which plays out as conflict, and one only needs to look at their experiences, the conflicts that they have in their life, the way they relate to others, the way they relate to themselves, and recognize that that's the proof right there. So when he says everything is a manifestation of the mental conversations which go on in us without our being aware of them, we can bring awareness onto these conversations like Dr. Len did, like we all do. This is not something new to us. What we want to do is practice this more often so we can have the ideal relationships, friendships, business partners, harmonious interactions with others, and so forth. And such has been the experience of working with this information as I further understood what my mentor had suggested. Now, the thing about this is that which go on without us being aware of them. So a person only needs to look at how they communicate about others, how others relate to them, how they relate to others, before they can identify what that thinking pattern is, because the outer world reflects that which we are imagining. And the truth of evidence of how we aspire, we could say, others to be, which is from the perspective of love, is really a result of imagining lovingly. So looking to the inner world of imagination as the proof. That which we imagine is the proof. That's how it works. That's the evidence. Now, we certainly get better at it with practice. Perhaps in the earlier stages, we seem to rely on the evidence of the five sensory experience and forget that the reflections are in the five sensory experience and the source is within. Now, I've had many mentors in my life. We've all had many mentors, and they show up in many different ways, revealing what's within ourselves. And me being an ENTJ, which is something that I identify with as far as my Myers-Briggs goes, I benefited from having many deep relationships with INFJs. These are individuals that I find that dwell in their imagination, see the internal world as reality, the inner world of imagination as reality. And in the earlier stages, I thought this was quite polarizing, because I saw this world as the reality, and it is reality, although a reflection of the internal reality. Now, they help me connect back to the feeling is the secret understandings that we've been discussing, because I realized that it was revealing to me my dwelling place. It would reveal my inner conversations. Based on navigating existence, feelingly, I would notice that I would discover these inner conversations. Not only was it apparent in how I was relating to others, conflict and so forth, but it was also apparent in the feeling. And I would ask myself, what does this feeling mean? What state of mind am I in? What are my thinking patterns? And I would be able to communicate to myself in a way based on a certain degree of understanding, to bring myself into a different state of mind. Because as he states, the world is a magic circle of infinite possible mental transformations. For there is an infinite number of possible mental conversations. Now, some might find this to be challenging because the data, the programming that they have not made peace with within themselves, is perhaps not allowing them to trust their own suggestions, their own imagination, which is one of the reasons why I recommend The Power of the Subconscious Mind by Joseph Murphy, because Dr. Len mentions this as well. The programming or the thinking patterns are within the subconscious. We might not be consciously aware of this, but it is revealed in our behaviors, in how we relate to others, in how they relate to us. And as he says, without such knowledge, he acts unconsciously. Everything is a manifestation of the mental conversations which go on in us without our being aware of them. As we make peace with these thinking patterns, we find it easier, as far as suggestion goes, to ourselves via inner dialogue, to bring us into that state of mind that's one with the vision. This has been the case for me as I've been working with this information all throughout the years. It allows me to look beyond the evidence of the five senses. If it appears to deny my vision, the reality is it's not appearing to deny my vision. Those are my own interpretations, a lot of times unconsciously, that I'm placing onto those experiences. But as I'm aware, based on how I feel, feeling is the secret, I recognize what state of mind that I'm in. And I can bring myself into a different state of mind by imagining or having an internal dialogue, even with combination with imagining. So he says it. He gives a great example. How would I send my word to help my friend? I would imagine that I am hearing his voice, that he is physically present, that my hand is on him. I would then congratulate him on his good fortune, tell him that I have never seen him look better. I would listen as though I heard him. I would imagine that he is telling me that he has never felt better. He has never been happier. And I would know that this loving, knowing communion with another, a communion populous with loving thoughts and feelings, that my word was sent, and it shall not return unto me void, but it shall prosper in the thing whereto I send. So the enemy plays out as theater in how we relate to others and how others relate to us, and we can make peace within ourselves. And so let's go ahead and go a little deeper into this, recognizing that our internal dialogue represents what state of mind that we're in. And by changing our internal dialogue, we can bring ourselves into a state of mind that's one with the vision. And if we have challenges accepting the suggestions, the self-suggestions, then we can make peace with the thinking patterns in which reactivity reveal. So number one, he says, the conditions and circumstances of life are not created by some power external to yourself. They are the conditions which result from the exercise of your freedom of choice, your freedom to choose the ideas to which you will respond. So there we see it, living in and from imagination of the ideal. When we do this, it's easier to look at the five sensory experience in relation to others, people, relationships, and so forth, and actually see them as in harmony and in contribution to the vision, imagining them lovingly. It's easier to imagine others lovingly. And so then they end up playing out the representation of love because we are actually imagining unto ourselves lovingly. By imagining lovingly unto others, the change happens within ourselves, such as the title here, Transformation of Others via Self, and also expressed and exemplified really well in the video series that I linked to with Dr. Len. Now, I've also worked with this in my relationships, in my business, in personal friendships, everything. And I want to continue to encourage this in myself because I could end up forgetting this. And I realized that one of the reasons why I could end up forgetting this is because I identify with the programming. It's revealed in how I see others. And the thing about that is how I see others shows up in my overthinking, my mental chatter, which is distinct from my true inner voice, the one that speaks from love. Because if I only listen to that true inner voice, the one that speaks from love, it will accurately show me how to imagine others. So we discussed this a few videos ago. I'll put a link in the description to that. Being your own best friend, many ways of doing it. I've shared the way that I do it. Happening in imagination. Again, recognizing that the evidence is in imagination and it expresses itself. So again, thanks to the INFJs in my life that help me see this. Help me realize that the true evidence of reality is found in imagination. That which I imagine lovingly, which expresses itself. Number two, the mind always behaves according to the assumption with which it starts. So we can assume anything to ourselves via inner conversation and accept that suggestion. If we have challenges with it, as mentioned, we can observe our reactivity to the suggestion and say, what is our internal dialogue in relation to that? And work with the power of the subconscious mind to change via autosuggestion the thinking patterns in relation to, and we'll notice the changes. I've done this with myself. I've worked with thousands of others to be able to do this as well, not just in a formal setting of consulting and through the business initiatives, working with team, vendors, and so forth, but everywhere I go. These are some of my favorite conversations to have. as Dr. Len would say, what within me is creating this? One of my favorite conversations to have with others is, what within myself? I say it, and they say it as well. Because as we mentioned, others reflect our thinking patterns. And if we believe that this is how it works, then we see others also reflecting those thinking patterns. As in, what within me? They also say the same thing. What within me is creating this experience? And I find it within myself. We find it within ourselves. And then we change our internal dialogue in relation to the experience as the experience changes. So we take 100% responsibility. We're not waiting for someone to say that. We do it within ourselves. He says the mind always behaves according to the assumption with which it starts. Therefore, to experience success, we must assume that we are successful. We must live wholly on the level of the imagination itself, and it must be consciously and deliberately undertaken. So let's zone in on this part here. We must live wholly on the level of imagination. We see in our mind's eye and commit to what we see in our mind's eye from the perspective of love in relation to the individuals in our life. And that is what creates reality, that imaginal scene. And that is the totality of all the evidence we need. No other evidence is needed other than the assumption that that's the way it is. Because it really is that way. I've also asked many people in conversations to prove this an equation. How do people really want to see themselves? They all say that they want to do what they really love to do, experience what they really love, live how they truly want to live, have love in their life. Love seems to be the universal thread. So imagining them how they truly are plays out in how we relate to them and how they relate to us. They seem to easily accept the suggestion, although we go back to the beginning here. The suggestion is happening to ourselves, within ourselves, from the perspective of love, and it plays out. And the internal dialogue stimulates it. And so he says, the great secret of success is a controlled inner conversation from premise of fulfilled desire. Now I promise, as it has been from my experience, it gets easier as we change our relationship to the unconscious thinking patterns that are brought to the surface as a result of experiencing reactivity, or how the theater plays out in how we relate to others. As we make peace with this, they change, we change. And it happens to deeper degrees. We can say magically so at deeper degrees. I've seen this in my own life in relation to my business consulting. Similar to what Dr. Len experienced when it comes to working with his patients. If a person believes these things are impossible or creates unnecessary friction within themselves, no need to shame themselves, no need to condemn themselves, which usually ends up playing out as shaming others and condemning others. None of that. We simply say, what is the programming within myself? Make peace with it. Have a conversation with it. As I had mentioned, one of the things that I do with myself is I travel in my imagination to worlds in which I discover these programming characters. They take on forms within myself. And I make peace with them. It's my way of doing it, in my own imagination. We could do it through internal dialogue in some shape or form because the changes are still happening in the world within and expressing itself. So again, the great secret of success is a controlled inner conversation from the premise of fulfilled desires. And here's the key to this. Control does not imply, as far as my experience of working with this information, as force. We're talking about loving, lighthearted conviction and self-suggestion. As Joseph Murphy had brought up in The Power of the Subconscious Mind, when working with the programming within ourselves, easy does it. Suggestive inner conversation from the premise of the wish fulfilled brings us into the state of mind, learning how to communicate with ourselves, building a relationship with the subconscious, understanding how to say things in a way that bypasses the programming getting to the root and making peace at a deeper level, thus transmuting that energy which can appear as enemy into energy that appears as friend. He says the only price you pay for success is the giving up of your former conversation, which belongs to the old man, the unsuccessful man. The time is ripe for many of us to take conscious charge in creating heaven on earth. To consciously and voluntarily use our imagination to inwardly hear and only say that which is in harmony with our ideal is actively bringing heaven on earth. Now, I like this. I want to echo this one more time. He says the time is ripe for many of us to take conscious charge in creating heaven on earth. Number 2, to consciously and voluntarily use our imagination. Recognize the evidence in our imagination via the inner dialogue, what we're imagining from the perspective of love. That's what we do, and everything changes as a result of it. Behaviors change, environments change, people change, we change. To inwardly hear inner conversations and only say that which is in harmony with our ideal is actively bringing heaven on earth every step along the way. So we have the opportunity to imagine the end, commit to that which we saw in relation to others in our imagination, and lightheartedly maintain that internal dialogue, which a lot of times happens automatically when we have not allowed ourselves to believe in certain interpretations or data within ourselves, programming that plays out as theater, as others playing out that theater within ourselves, the behaviors which represent argumentations and whatever else conflict that represent the theater within ourselves. That is what we can refer to when we see, without such knowledge, he acts unconsciously. Everything is a manifestation of the mental conversations which go on in us without our being aware of them. So now we're aware of them more so. And then we find the source of those thinking patterns within ourselves, and we make peace with those thinking patterns. Then we find it's easier to maintain that flow and dwelling in the feeling of the wish fulfilled in relation to others. So I trust you found this video to be helpful and in contribution to your relationships with others. Let's go ahead and conclude this with an autosuggestion to further encourage and instill this understanding, allowing us to transcend past doubt, indecision-based thinking patterns, which seem to create conflict in the mind. And by releasing from these thinking patterns, we can allow ourselves to suggest to ourselves the ideal conversations that play out as the theater, flow-based journey to realizing our visions. We could say, I recognize through the mental world the potentiality of infinite number of possible mental conversations that play out as the world which represents the magic circle of infinite possible mental transformations. I realize that through the power of inner talking, I pick the direct path in relation from the perspective of flow, love, ease, to realizing my visions, bringing forth harmonious relationships with others, thus allowing me to lightheartedly let go and release from the energy that seems to play out as conflict in relation to others, as I allow into a state of mind that is ideal with my vision. As I'm able to experience this every day, I recognize the reality of my imagination and my ability to stimulate through inner conversation the realities in which I travel in mind. And this understanding reveals the magical circle of infinite possible mental transformation in which I find myself automatically expressing the ideal inner conversation from the perspective of love in relation to others, which transforms my reality accordingly. If you would like a copy of this mind map, The link is in the description. Thank you very much for watching. I'll talk to you soon. Take care.